morning, everyone. Thank you to Abby and everyone at Digital Isle for inviting me here today. My name's Dan Wall. I'm a partner with the advisory firm Regulus Partners. We're going to have a panel discussion in a short while, and I'm very happy to be joined by our panellists on the stage here. We have Ruben Portanier of the legal firm GTG and formerly the CEO of the Malta Gaming Authority, Ben Wood, who's Bally's Managing Director here on the Isle of Man, Steve Brennan, who, as you all know, is the CEO of the Gambling Supervision Commission, and then finally, at the end of the stage, Kirsty Knight, who is a Senior Compliance Consultant with Amber Gaming and formerly held various roles within the government here on the Isle of Man. We were a bit ahead of schedule, which is great because I think there's a lot to discuss. It's also a challenge for me because I've only budgeted for a half-hour session. So please do think of questions and don't be shy. You can submit them by Slido. I'm assuming, given the nature of the conference, everyone's digitally prepared. Or you can just stick your hand in the air and go analog. But yeah, please do ask questions because, first of all, we have rehearsed some of this, so the panelists are very comfortable with what with the responses to the answers they've been prepped for, but they don't know what you're going to ask. So it's far more interesting if you can throw a few curveballs in there. Sorry, guys. Right, I'm just going to say a few words about some trends in the global e-gaming market, and in particular, some of the headwinds that operators and regulators face. This will lead seamlessly, I hope, into our panel discussion about what these trends and others mean for the Isle of Man's e-gaming ecosystem. We'll thus travel the road for some very large, long-term structural issues that will affect the health of the industry globally, to the more immediate matters facing everyone operating in the ecosystem here on the Isle of Man. Before I start, I need to ask a couple of health and safety questions. So please, can you put your hands in the air if you're attending this conference here today with your other halves, kids, parents, or any other family members? A half hand went up there, I think. Can you put your hand in the air if you're not planning to go to the movies tonight? I understand that the Palace offers a choice of either Black Adam or Harry Potter. Anyone off to the flips tonight? No, oh dear. This is quite bad. I'll come back to that and explain why in a moment. Because the first headwind I want to talk about is the rise of public health as the lodestone of gambling policy in an increasing number of jurisdictions around the world. And public health is an important field in disease prevention that seeks to put in place coordinated and generally upstream measures to promote positive population health. If you have people suffering from cholera, you can treat them by all means, but it's much more effective if you go upstream and sort out the water supply. Its principles have long been incorporated within gambling policies in order to protect vulnerable people. In recent years, however, we've seen sensible principles replaced with dogma. Hegemonic public health approaches demand far more stringent population-level controls on wagering. And this leads me back to the shocking absence of family members here today and the paucity of cinema going in the audience. Because according to the new public health perspective, we are harmed if we choose to spend money on going to the bingo club, betting shop, casino, or gambling online, rather than going to the cinema. We are harmed if we spend less time with family members as a result of having a punt on the horses. This may strike some of you, and I hope it does, as a little bit mad, but there is a method here. In the past, we've typically considered the negative consequences of harmful gambling through the lens of psychiatry and the recognised mental health condition of gambling disorder. A gambling disorder is utterly horrible, but it's also relatively rare. The American Psychiatric Association estimates its typical international prevalence at around 1% of the adult population. The most recent official estimate in Great Britain from 2018 is around 0.2% of the population, or about 0.4% of those who gamble. It's also far from clear that gambling disorder is solely about gambling, as it typically involves a range of other comorbid disorders. In fact, investigations by the American Psychiatric Association in the run-up to the publication of the DSM-5 raised the question of whether it was even a discrete disorder, or whether instead it represented a set of behaviours associated with general mental ill health. Harm, on the other hand, is not clearly defined, and so can be whatever we decide it is. By crashing the threshold of what is considered harmful to the level of not going to the flicks, it is possible to claim population level harm, and thus to insist on far more stringent population level controls, such as relatively low limits on how much an adult is permitted to spend on gambling in any given month. Lest anyone be tempted to dismiss this as academic crackpottery, it is worth bearing in mind that Britain's Gambling Commission has stated that it considers anyone who goes to the bingo instead of the pictures to be harmed. Prior to its disbandment last year, Public Health England stated that gambling should be tackled in the same way as tobacco smoking, an activity that the government plans to stub out by the end of this decade. This year, the Office of Health Improvement and Disparities, which subsumed Public Health England, funded a report that recommended, amongst other things, a ban on in-play and spread betting, a total ban on gambling advertising and marketing, and the introduction of plain packaging, which would mean no colours, logos or trademarks on any gambling products or websites. This is not just an issue in Britain. Numerous jurisdictions in Western Europe, as well as Australia and New Zealand, have gravitated in the direction of public health models for the regulation of gambling, characterised by marketing curbs and restrictions on spending at home. The second related headwind that I want to touch on is the trend towards increasing tax rates on remote gambling. In recent months, we've seen duty hikes for online gambling in Italy, Romania, the Netherlands and Australia. During a period of fiscal squeeze, tax increases on gambling represent a fairly unresented means of raising revenue for the state. Finance ministries have worked out that in contrast with traditional land-based gambling, the remote sector is pretty resilient to the effects of tax increases, which squeeze operator margins but tend not to diminish the size of the overall market. It is not, however, all doom and gloom, and in our panel discussion we will discuss the exciting opportunities for the sector. But the two headwinds that I've touched on this morning have potentially profound implications for the long-term health of the industry. And that's my sunny disposition start to the session. Fortunately, our panellists are far more upbeat and cheerful souls, and hopefully we can. I've lowered the pitch to such a level that we can only go upwards from here. So we're going to kick into some questions now, but again, please do fire in the questions on Slido. If I can work out, yeah. Or just raise your hands as we go along. Okay. I want to start with Steve. And switch pace slightly, but I guess anti-money laundering is a sort of close cousin of social responsibility. And in the last 6 months, we've seen Malta and Gibraltar placed under increased monitoring by the FATF. What insights have you been able to draw from these events? And at the risk, I don't want you to tempt fate here, but at the risk of tempting fate, can you explain what it is about your approach to regulation of the market that gives you assurance?
Okay, yes. Thanks for that, Dan. Money laundering and making the first topic upbeat. Yeah, thanks.
We're going up.
We will. You've set a very low bar. So the first point is really around money value valuations and the reports, and I think it's very important to recognise actually they do mean something, and they have to be taken. They have to be the focus of every jurisdiction, and I'll come on to why that's important soon. But the conclusions and the recommendations, they can have a significant impact on the jurisdictions, not only just the governments and their ratings, but also those key sectors and the economy more broadly. So I think when money val comes, it's often seen as actually it's Isle of Man government that is addressing that money val issue. But if that gets wrong, if we get that wrong, and we get a negative rating or a poor rating, that can be really, really detrimental. And I think the examples that have just been cited with Malta and Gibraltar coming into focus really brings it home actually that these super regulatory authorities will look at us, will look at different jurisdictions, and they won't be afraid to say that's not good enough and put them on grey listings and the like, and those grey listings will have that real detrimental effect. And what's been interesting with Gibraltar and Malta is, and particularly Malta, is that Malta is a European jurisdiction and it's still got grey listed. And if anybody thought there was a level of politics behind looking after each other in an EU perspective, I think that sort of says, well, maybe that's not quite the case. So I think these super regulatory authorities are going to come, they're going to do their evaluations, and everybody really does need to be up to snuff at the regulatory level, at the government level, and at the stakeholder level, in order to ensure that we don't necessarily fall foul of their conclusions and recommendations. And the second point really is, and I've sort of started to labour it a little bit really, is that responsibility falls to everybody in the room, and we've had that conversation in the previous session about this is about collaborative working for the greater good, which the three islands were talking about, and the Minister opened by saying that we'll only succeed together, and I think that's quite correct for Moneyval as well. For the gambling sector, to turn into that sort of specifically, there's only one international standard that we've got. Gambling still really is fairly immature in its international standards, but the one standard we do have is around AML-CFT, which is driven by FATF. So everybody knows what these standards are, everybody knows what's expected, everybody knows how they're going to get measured, and everybody knows what's going to be the focus of the regulator. So it should come as no surprise when we're coming out to you and talking about what we require in order to make sure that our sector is compliant. We're not going to get a bad mark, we're not going to get poor recommendations from those super regulators when they come. I think the way to Dan's point at the end there really, which was what do we do? How does the GSC go about its regulatory craft to get its reassurance? We don't necessarily get reassurance, we understand the method that we're in. We set those standards through our code and our guidance. I think our guidance is really quite comprehensive. I'll take feedback from the audience on that, but I think the guidance that we've put in is really quite comprehensive around AML-CFT. But the other thing that we'll always do, and people who listen to me speak at other conferences will have heard this so many times now, but we have a very open door policy. So not only do we have the code and the guidance, but we'll welcome anyone to come in and discuss what our expectation is of that. And we often find that when we've had those conversations and have understood the GSC's interpretation of what we're looking for, then that can get reflected back into their practices and procedures, and it tends to minimise the wear and tear of trying to make sure that the operators are compliant with the views and expectations of us.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I'm pleased to say that we have got questions coming in now. In fact, a couple of them probably relate to this question, but I'll quickly ask Ruben, because we talked about Malta, to talk about bring us up to speed with what's happened there. And actually, again, I think that's a sort of positive movement. And then we've got a question here, which I think I might throw to Kirsty, which is about the EU placing gambling into the highest category for money laundering risk, and how it says, how do you see this impacting local providers having to change their approach to customer due diligence? So, but Ruben, can you bring us up to speed on Malta and perhaps offer any insights for Ireland and other jurisdictions?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here today. Okay, we've touched upon AML and the grey listing element that Malta had to go through and managed to get out of as well. So one element which I would like to amplify upon is an international wave of seeing jurisdictions in a different way that used to happen in the past, whereby FATF are actually taking a much more forceful approach than before. The second is the other global wave that is happening in terms of national authorization licensing systems, whereby, as we're going along, more countries are coming up with their own boundary-based licensing system, and that has a consequence on countries like Malta, who are a licensing country like Malta, and so as Isle of Man. And the third element, which I see as a global wave hitting us, is the activity that is going on from an M&A perspective in the gaming sector. Now, if I had to look at the first point, which has to do with grey listing and AML and what have you, here is where I have to concur with what Steve was mentioning earlier, that AML is not a matter of government to deal with. It's a matter that all the ecosystem has to deal with. And Malta is a testimony of this situation, whereby there were some deficiencies, not many, just 3 of them, but there were some deficiencies which were highlighted by FATF, which resulted in Malta being grey-listed. Some of those deficiencies, 2 of them were a consequence of the state not acting forcefully enough in enforcing the law in terms of putting enough prosecutions in terms of money laundering. But the third one was because the ecosystem was not doing its part as well from an AML point of view. This notwithstanding that the gaming sector in Malta was the only sector that came out with flying colours from the FATF review. The element of getting out of the grey list, which was done in 11 months, which was a record turnaround, was again because there was a concerted effort, not only by government, yes, government was leading the way, but by the sector in its totality trying to get out of it, because the consequences of remaining on a grey list could be very damning. Luckily, the period was very long, it was very short, so the consequence was not that pronounced. This gives some food for thought and maybe some elements which Isle of Man can look at in terms of experience and see, one, why did Malta get into that grey list in the first place? There is, yes, now I'm not anymore part of the state establishment. I'm not a regulator any longer, so I can speak a bit more freely. But yes, there were some political issues, international political diplomatic issues, which put Malta and I guess even Gibraltar on the grey list. But there were also institutional shortcomings. And I think Isle of Man should look at those shortcomings in order to preempt what Maneval would be assessing, but also trying to embrace the ecosystem, the service providers, the gaming licensees, the banks, in order to have a unified approach for the assessment and then after that. And I think today's event is a very encouraging start for that. The other element which I would like to touch upon in terms of what global wave was hitting the island of Malta was the need for growth. Malta had a concerted strategy over the past 10 years or so in order to grow in various digital fields, including also gaming field, which resulted in the population increasing by some 25% over 10 years, having some issues on infrastructure, but the 25% increase was fueled in order to cater for the growth. Again, over there might be some lessons that, Isle of Man, I was hearing the presentations earlier when there is a growth plan that the island wants to embark upon, and I think there's some blueprint that can be looked upon from Malta in order not to maybe repeat certain mistakes and take on what actually worked in our case.
Okay, thank you. So firstly, the question from Danny on Slido, EU placing gambling in the high risk category, how is this impacting local providers?
Okay, was it specific to CDD, was it, Dan?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so obviously the island is upcoming for its Moneyval evaluation, so the fact that the sector has been highlighted as high risk is probably potentially far from ideal. However, I don't necessarily see it as a negative thing. As Steve said, we have the code, we have the handbook, and it gives a clear set of guidance. And the way it's set out, it's 5WH, what do you do, how do you do it, when do you do it? And with the regulator being as open and pragmatic as they are, I don't necessarily see the fact that the sector has been placed as being high risk being a concern, because we have the support, we have the guidance, we have the knowledge and the skills within the sector. We have a really highly skilled compliance sector on island, that's well versed in dealing with the code, the handbook and the regulator. It's just adapting to the enhanced way of working, whereas before it may have been a handful of people that may be considered high risk. The fact that the jurisdiction is high risk, it will result in reconsiderations of our internal business risk assessments, re-evaluating our risk appetite, documenting that and working with the regulator to manage the change in risk rating on Ireland for this particular sector. But I don't foresee it being a negative impact on the sector as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Ben, you've been very patient. I'll come to you now with a couple of questions, actually. One here from Anonymous, whoever you are. Moving away from AML towards social responsibility, I guess, but is technology the answer to meeting public health expectations rather than countrywide restrictions, using tech to identify vulnerable people and helping them?
On its own, no. It's a human element. I mean, just from our perspective, Bally's takes RG exceptionally seriously. I mean, you know, we have a large business in the UK, which is under, you know, the ever-increasing difficult and harder RG expectations that that jurisdiction has. Bally's is obviously a US listed company, so we're heavily into those markets now. The same issues will be coming along, and as those US markets open up, you know, technology is not going to solve everything when it comes to, you know, vulnerable gamblers. You know, you have to have stops in space. Of course, there are all sorts of algorithms that are there as a first stop, but ultimately, when it comes to recognising, I think it's towards the end of some of those processes on evaluation, there will always be a human element involved in that.
Okay, thanks. And actually, just staying with this, we've got another anonymous question here saying, and perhaps this is one for Steve in the first instance, but spending and affordability is an important but subjective factor, and unlike tobacco or alcohol, same level of consumption may not be as critical to some as to others. Can you ensure both player freedom and corporate responsibility, that they are balanced and don't contradict one another?
I think at the moment I'll quite easily answer that and say yes, because it's not really something that we're focused on in the Isle of Man. If I can offer a view, I think this is largely driven, or largely an activity that we see with the UK regulator and the focus that that's bringing. That does cause also regulatory authorities in different jurisdictions to have a look at the actions and the outcomes of that to see and measure against our player base. But at the moment, the focus that the UK has got on affordability checks is not something that is certainly not touching the Isle of Man just yet. In our framework, it's not something that we're seeing through any of our compliance visits. We're not seeing it through any of our complaints or any other interventions that we've got. And talking to regulatory colleagues as I attend different regulatory conferences, that's not something that's on the regulatory sort of agenda just yet. It's coming. CSR has always been on there, but it's just a different flavour of CSR. So we'll see how that matures over the coming years.
Okay, thanks. And Ben, coming back to you, and you know, if you can help me out here by raising the tone. You know, the subject of today's discussion is headwinds, but there are tailwinds. There are opportunities for the sector globally. How well positioned do you think the Isle of Man is to fill its sails with these tailwinds, particularly with regard to people in infrastructure?
People in infrastructure. I mean, there's been a lot of chat this morning about skills. I don't know how we're on the same issue, but we know it is an issue on the Isle of Man. Certainly for the the very highly qualified specialist front-end Martech type qualifications. I mean, these things are not easily skills that you can actually get in London. You know, and we struggle as a global group to recruit these people anywhere, let alone on the Isle of Man. Infrastructure-wise, again, you know, look, Isle of Man, connectivity, data centres. You know, I was in the tech industry in a previous life, and the Isle of Man has always prided itself on extremely high quality data centres and connectivity, and this, so I don't have to tell you guys in the room about that. We are extremely well positioned to continue to push that forward. I think the main thing is, for me, is, you know, I've been fortunate to work in the B2B side of the industry as well as the B2C industry. You know, I've done business across all the major jurisdictions in the world, I've seen the whole regulations changing over the last decade. And I think we've got to be slightly cautious in that the addressable market is potentially closing. I mean, that's logical, you know, as you know, more nation states actually start to regulate. But there are still massive swathes of the planet out there that are still addressable market for the Isle of Man licensees and for support services on the Isle of Man that might be supporting other licensed jurisdictions. So I'm still, I'm a perennial salesman, so I'm always optimistic. But certainly we look at some markets at the moment. One thing that was interesting, and Ruben might be saying, is when FATFA went on the grey list 18 months ago originally, the industry was awash in innuendo that was the end of Malta. And everybody was picking up the phone, talking to each other, and we expected on the Isle of Man a huge swathe of, you know, licensees to look at this. That was never going to happen because the defensible position in Malta is that it's in the EU. But, you know, there's this sudden expectation that there was going to be this huge influx of business coming to the island and other jurisdictions from Malta. That never materialised. However, there are pressure on other jurisdictions around the world whereby there is certainly opportunity for the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man as an offshore jurisdiction is probably the highest regarded one. When, you know, we talked about AML, we talked about our stringent rules that we have outside of pure gaming. So you look at potentially Latin America, there are still markets in Asia which is still addressable. There are still markets in Africa which just haven't even begun to start maturing yet. So I still think there is a medium to long-term opportunity for the Isle of Man, and we've absolutely got the tools to go at it.
Great. Just want to check, does anybody want to raise a hand and ask a question? Or are you all comfortable with the iPad? Good. Okay. Kirsty, can you just go? Where do you see the pinch points around resource?
I'm obviously heavily compliance focused, so I would say that we have noticed in the compliance arena there are pinch points in getting people appointed to specific compliance roles. Amber as a group have gone very different in their recruitment approach, and we now recruit good people for positions irrelevant of pieces of paper and qualifications, and we are very fond of the grow your own, supporting people internally through external qualifications and driving and writing internal training programs to upskill our own people from grassroots up to progress through the business. I think that's something that everyone can do, and realise that there are certain skill sets that are transferable, compliance being one of them. So just because you are currently compliant in a law firm doesn't mean that you can't transfer that skill and come and work in gaming, or vice versa. We need to look at the skills that we need and how we can transfer those across and utilise those within the sector. I think things like locate and bringing attracting people over to the island, working with businesses, with government, having locate has been brilliant throughout the year. I know Ali has done a locate piece for Locate Isle of Man. It's a really, really good thing to do, to highlight the kind of work-life balance that you get over here, and the pulls that might draw someone over here to versus another jurisdiction. The talent portal, again, can be utilised for both a person looking to change their career or for someone looking to pull from some talent that their current resources are running dry. Another great initiative from the government to try and assist industry to plug the gaps where they've been identified. So hopefully I've added a bit more of a positive slant to this kind of panel discussion, in that it isn't all doom and gloom. There are definite positive strides being taken between public and private sector to plug the gaps, identify areas for improvement. And this hasn't just been a new thing, it has been around for quite some time. We have got the EGSAB, let me get that acronym right, where public and private have been working together for 15 years now in the eGaming sector, where all different types of people meet around a table to discuss how they can work together, how they can help the sector continue to grow. That involves banking, TCSPs, the regulator, and it's a very open, honest discussion around what's needed currently in the sector, what can the regulator do to help, what can private sector do to help assist the regulator with what's new, what's up and coming, and sharing that knowledge with them so that they know what they need to prepare themselves for to go forward.
Okay, thanks. And we're sort of moving now, I think, into injury side of this discussion. But there's a couple that I'll just throw out very quickly. And anybody raise your hand if you want to answer it. But first of all, we've got: do you think the change in licence fee structure in Gibraltar will benefit the Isle of Man? Perhaps following on from some of Ben's comments. And also, are there improvements required to things like transport links, visa requirements, etc., that can attract people in more internationally into this jurisdiction? Anybody fancy giving a very quick response? Steve?
Very quick response on licence fees. I don't think licence fees are the major consideration for a company to relocate to the Isle of Man. So, if I could answer that in a tweet, that would be it.
Okay, brilliant.
I'd agree with that as well. I think on look, it's no big secret. COVID, damaged the whole world when it came to travel, and we're with us as an island nation still reeling from it. We tried to open an office during COVID. It was interesting. It happened. It worked. The flights are coming more and more. Yes, I mean this is a problem that's not just for the gaming industry on the island. It's for all corporates on the island. So. We just need more flights and more availability, but I don't think we're the only airport in the world that's asking for that one.
Okay.
Yeah, operators, and I think you would definitely agree with me, look at the total cost of operation. So they don't look at if the license fee is cheap and maybe the operation is very expensive to sustain, or vice versa. That is what an operator would look at. And that also includes having, adequate connections, etc., which is part of the cost of operation as well. So they will look at a global figure rather than a particular item.
Okay, and then another quick fire one here. Perhaps Ben, does regulation and strict player protection drive high value players to the illegal market?
Sorry, just repeat that again.
Do regulations and strict player protection, so I suppose over-regulation perhaps, drive high-value players to the illegal market?
Thanks.
Or you can nominate someone else.
That's a complex question. I think that's too generalised for one specific market or one specific set of regulations. Look, there is a danger with what's happening in the UK that it will continue to over-regulate and continue to go in that direction. There is a danger most definitely a danger that will happen. I think when we look at a new market to go into as a group, or any company should do this. Obviously, you make your own assessment. You look at the value and the value that market is going to bring to you. One thing that's for sure over the regulation over the last decade or so in Europe is that those markets that become potentially new punitive. I mean, channelization is difficult. They have major issues with it in Sweden at the beginning, but there is. Anecdotally, there is a risk that could happen, but I think the general populace that you need to protect will stay in the regulated market.
Okay, and I think perhaps the last one, and maybe if I can throw this to you, Ruben, how can we improve and measure the competent performance of the regulatory bodies more frequently outside of the Moneyval inspections? Quality regulatory authorities provide a great business environment, so says Anonymous, who's been very prolific on the iPad this morning.
Well, being a former regulator myself, and now have been in the advisory sphere for the past 8 years, what I can say, what makes a difference is if you do have a regulatory body that, one, knows what they're doing, they have the expertise, and they are open to listening to what the industry has to say. If you don't have those three components, then you are looking at a jurisdiction which is interesting to be in. I can see, okay, let's assume that Steve is not here, but I can see the ILO, the GSC being one of those regulatory bodies that do embrace those three principles, in my view. Malta had this approach as well in the past, maybe it's a bit losing that. The UK had that approach. It has lost it completely, in my view, whereby the UK GC has become practically unapproachable from a one-to-one approach. Isle of Man is different, GSC is different, and I think that is something to build upon, embrace, and continue to nurture.
Great, and with 1 second to spare. So fantastic, Simon. Thank you, everyone. That is the final whistle. Thank you, everyone, for listening, for firing in your questions, and thanks to the panellists for providing such insightful commentary.